Hey there, this is Ina from Taproot Tarot. Today I have a vintage unboxing of an old sealed deck that I'm really excited about, and it also gives me an opportunity to talk about a pattern, which is a derivative of the Tarot de Marseille, the Piedmontese or Piemontese pattern. It's not a super consistent or standardized pattern, but it has some really unique characteristics that are super fun. And so I thought it'd be kind of entertaining to compare a few decks that have those similar characteristics, which are super quirky and cool. But the main thing is I'm super excited to have this deck. It's one of these Lo Scarabeo vintage reproductions of historical decks that came out around 1995. This one is a 1995 copy. At first I was concerned because it's a sealed copy and it has a sticker on it with the ISBN for Llewellyn. So when it arrived I thought, oh no, is this a fake? Did I end up with unwittingly something that had been a copy? And I went through and checked all of the images of vintage copies like this and determined that yes, this is what they used to do around the 1995 printing date, was to have this plain bottom which says Lo Scarabeo, and then have this sticker either on the side or across the bottom here. And later on they even had smaller stickers that fit a little better on this flap for different decks, not this one. And I hadn't noticed it before in other vintage decks. I even have this one, the Ancient Tarots of Lombardy, which is from the same style, and you can see it has the same notation on the bottom, Lo Scarabeo 1995. But what I'm guessing happened is, a lot of these decks, probably when they were first purchased, people just took these stickers off, which makes perfect sense. It just happens to be that this one is still sealed and it still has its sticker. And funnily, when I get one that doesn't have a sticker, it didn't even occur to me to wonder, why is there not an ISBN on here? So I'm going to unbox this sealed vintage deck with you and then compare it to a couple of other decks that have some Piedmontese or Piemontese characteristics. From here on out, I will use the English pronunciation with a D, Piedmontese, although you will often see it spelled without a D, which I'm assuming is pronounced in a more Italian way. And you may or may not know that the Fournier Spanish Tarot is based on an old Marseille deck, an old Marseille style deck that was printed in Piedmont. And even though it is often considered to be a pretty straightforward Marseille deck, we'll see that it actually does have some Piedmontese characteristics, which become more exaggerated later on. But we'll talk about that more in a minute. Let's first unbox this vintage tarot. So what do you think? Should I keep this sticker on? I'm not going to decide today. But let me know what you would do. So this can sometimes be a really pricey deck, but I've been watching it for a while, and what I've noticed is that there are a lot of them for sale, and they don't tend to get sold. So, sometimes you'll see them very pricey, in the several hundreds, definitely over 100. But I've noticed lately that they keep getting listed on eBay for like $99 and then not selling. So my assumption, I'm not like an super avid collector, but my assumption is that probably means that there are more out there than there is demand. So here we have a little bit of damage on the box, but looks like that did not affect the cards. A little bit of bowing, which I often see with this series of decks. Here it is, Antichi Tarocchi Liguria-Piemontese. And Giovanbattista Guala, or Guala, 1820. Not sure about the accuracy of that date. 1995 was not a time of very accurate tarot history, which we'll see in a moment. So I wasn't in a position to be paying a ton of money for a collectible deck, but I did want to get a hold of this, and I happened to find it on a Facebook trade group. Somebody who needed to get rid of some decks due to moving. And because of the fact that I had seen so many that weren't selling, I felt pretty comfortable offering a price that I could afford. and the seller happily accepted. So I was pretty excited about that. So I'm super lucky to have gotten this for the price that I received it for. And it was kind of a win-win because, like I said, these aren't selling very quickly. This was someone who kind of needed to find a home for some of their decks in order to move. And so it worked out for everybody. So there are a few different versions of this. The one with the temperance on it was the one that I wanted because it only has writing below the card. There is another version that has strength or fortitude on the box, and that one has writing above and below, which I just found to be a little more crowded. So I kind of like how this just doesn't look quite as cluttered. There is another version of this, which I think was only available in Italy, and it's the Divinatore version, and it has the Hermit on the cover. That one only has writing on the bottom, but it's Italian divinatory meanings rather than labels. And one of the first things we notice is this double black line, which is a Piedmontese characteristic, the double border. These older decks come with a bunch of instructional cards. My Lombardy one has one as well, has these as well. And I really enjoy them. Actually, what they say is pretty useful. But what I'm hoping for is a little bit of history on this particular deck. So these are all instructional. They don't seem to be have any history to them. But here is the back. I was really looking forward to having this particular back because the one with the strength on the cover has a more graphic back, kind of like what you see with the Tarot of the Master that has a magician as the back. And I'm not as much of a fan of that as I am of a more traditional pattern on the back. So I'm going to get all three of these decks in the same order, and then I'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about the Piedmontese pattern. I'll be starting with the Fool because that is one of the more iconic Piedmontese cards. But like I said, none of these are going to be super matchy-matchy like we see with other patterns because the production just wasn't as standardized in this region. So we'll see a lot of similarities and quirks, but they won't be totally consistent. In his book, Mystical Origins of the Tarot, Paul Hewson has an appendix, it's Appendix 1 in the back of the book, which lists several of the more common patterns in tarot. Now, when we're talking about tarot patterns, those are separate from pip patterns, for example. So we can have a French tarot pattern, such as the Tarot de Marseille, but it has Italian pips, for example. So it follows the standard Italian pip pattern. So patterns get very wibbly-wobbly and not very, they get confusing. And Hewson even mentions that the Lombardy pattern and the Piedmontese pattern get confused. And so I will be referencing the Tarot Heritage site by Cheryl Smith. And one of the links I'll share where she discusses the origins of the Piedmontese style, she does categorize this deck by Zoya, featured in Camelia Elias's book, Marseille Tarot, Toward the Art of Reading, as a Piedmontese deck, and it is not. I took a look at it. It's definitely part of the Lombardy pattern. And I'll talk about that more in a future video where I will talk about the Lombardy pattern. So like I said, Hewson says the Lombardy and Piedmontese patterns get mixed up, partially because those two regions are close. Also, patterns, again, are just very wishy-washy, wibbly-wobbly, and especially in the past, they haven't been clearly defined. In fact, Hewson's book was published in 2004, and back then, Type 1 and Type 2 TDM hadn't been delineated, as far as I can tell. The Swiss pattern hadn't been labeled at that point. So Hewson's book is not actually very helpful in defining the characteristics of the Piedmontese tarot, because they're just characteristics of the Type 1 TDM. So I had to look at other sources for sure. Cheryl Smith's post on the characteristics of the Piedmontese tarot to be specific. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think Stuart Kaplan is a little bit to blame for that confusion as well. This is volume 1 of his Tarot Encyclopedia from 1978. By the way, I always thought that this entire series of books was way too expensive to be in my budget. That's not true of volume 1. I got this, it's in brand new condition for 21 bucks, y'all. So I highly recommend getting at least volume 1 of Stuart Kaplan's Encyclopedia of the Tarot. I doubt I'll get the others because I have a ton of tarot history books and I don't need to be paying hundreds of dollars for any of them. But I do want to point out here is this is an example of the Lombardy pattern. But Stuart Kaplan writes up here, whereas Paul Hewson does mention that the Lombardy pattern is sometimes also referred to as the Venice pattern, Stuart Kaplan says, the so-called Tarocchi of Venice or Lombardy pack is more commonly known as the Piedmontese tarot. So that's not true. This is a Lombardy pattern. And later on, we have the Lando tarot on page 150 of his book, and this is an example of the Piedmontese pattern. Now, where a deck was made is not going to determine what pattern it follows. For example, that Zoya deck from Camelia Elias's book was made in Turin, which is the capital of Piedmont, but it's still a Lombardy pattern tarot. So that's another another confusing factor. So this one was made by Giuseppe Lando of Turin. The date here is 1760, and I have my doubts about that based on Giordano Berti's book. And Berti does show a different card, a devil card from a Lando deck, which is labeled Lando. You can see here, it says Lando Torino. And I'll show you Berti's book in a moment, but notice here, this is a very characteristic Piedmontese devil. These imps have horns rather than antlers, and the wings are a little different from the other Lando deck that I'll show you in a moment. But we'll talk more about these characteristics. I'll keep this open in case I need to reference the Lando deck. So I don't think that 1760 date is correct. So here is Giordano Berti's The History of Tarot, self-published on Amazon. Highly recommend. It has been translated into English by Alexandra Valentina Miron, and she's a hero for doing this because this book is so good. An excellent reference. So here is another example of a Lando devil, which we can see has antlers, a face that's very different. He doesn't have that bald-headed look that the Piedmontese devil often has. There's still kind of a folkloric heavy carving style to it that we'll see a lot in the Piedmontese decks. But this is also a tarot of G. Lando of Turin, 1832, and that's much more likely than the 1700s. Now, according to Berti, there are some records in the 15 and 1600s of card making in Piedmont, but we have zero existing decks from that era or even evidence of production. Just a little bit of paperwork and literature here and there. The first surviving deck that we have that was made in Piedmont was the Ottone deck, which is now housed in the Museum of Fournier in Vitoria, Spain, and it is the basis for the Spanish tarot by Fournier. And the deck here is dated as 1736. And according to Berti, this was printed by Giuseppe Ottone. And according to Hewson, it was a factory in the Sesia River Valley city called Scarabeo. Again, that's 1736, which is very interesting because in 1742 is when Pierre Chaminade printed his deck, also in Piedmont, and also in Scarabeo. So that's really interesting. It's just 6 years later. I showed my Chaminade deck in a couple videos back, comparing a few different beautiful Marseille tarots. Now that was a French creator who moved to the Piedmont region and created a very French deck. It's really a standard TDM. Now this one often gets labeled as a standard TDM, but I would definitely disagree, and I think you can already start seeing a little bit of that where there are similarities to the Piedmontese style. So what we have record of is 1700s. We've got some decks existing. They're definitely based on the Marseille. in Piedmont, and even some of them are just standard Marseille decks, and some of them have some quirks that are more regional. And it isn't until the 1800s that we really start to see the Piedmont pattern really emerge. And around 1830 is when we see the card maker Vergnano, and this is probably one of the most iconic Piedmontese fools, with his very poofy pants, the tassel on his pack, a visor on his hat, a long pointy beard, and he's got this butterfly, which is considered iconic for the Piedmontese style, but this didn't appear until this particular deck. So we have some earlier decks that don't necessarily have that. Again, it's not a standardized pattern. This is another one also by Vergnano, but it's from 1828. It's a little earlier, and some characteristics we see are that it looks like a TDM Betelure. This one is even labeled in French, whereas later Piedmontese decks are labeled in Italian. But he has the tools of a cobbler on his table, including a hammer and even a shoe. He also has a chair sitting behind him, one that he could sit in. And so that could be reminiscent of the later Milanese or Sopraffino decks, where we have very distinctly a cobbler instead of a street magician or juggler. And here Berti has also represented this deck here, the Guala or Huala tarot, with the world who is standing on a globe on the earth. So that is another characteristic that we're going to be looking for. Not too long after this Piedmontese style started to develop, it changed. In the late 1800s, it changed over to the double-headed style that we now see as a Piedmontese deck, which is still in production today. So we're going to compare this also with the Beltramo Torino, so also made in Turin, the capital of Piedmont. This is the deck printed by Nova Mundi, available both on MPC and GameCrafter. The yellow box that I just showed you is the one from GameCrafter. And she says this was made in 1850 in Turin. She notes that it has both Piedmont and Lombardy characteristics. Personally, I would say it definitely leans more Piedmont, and I'll talk about that more when I do a follow-up video on the Lombardy pattern. So let's compare these. Now, I wouldn't say any of the three of these could be considered a quintessential Piedmontese deck. For example, we have poofy pants all across the board here in the Fool, but it's not as exaggerated as we saw in the Vergnano deck. We have a little bit of a tassel at the bottom of the pack here. Again, not as exaggerated as Vergnano, and no tassel on either of these. But there is a certain quality to the way he's holding his head and looking out at us that just has a different vibe from the TDM, the standard TDM Fool. And I want to note here, this one is labeled Il Pazzo, which is super interesting. So keeping in mind, these are both from the 1800s, 1820 or thereabouts, although Berti dates this as approximately 1830, which is probable. This one's from 1850, but this one's 100 years earlier, 1736. And yet, as we see here, these two both have the characteristic chair sitting behind him. You can see the chair legs ready to be sat upon. Both of them have cobbler tools. We see a shoe here on his table. And these are all looking much more like workbench type tools. We have nails, which would be used by a cobbler. Much more than the accoutrement of a juggler. Here we see some fairly more standard dice, cups, things like that. But look at this. What is that? We don't see that in a standard TDM. But there's definitely something there. Almost looks like a horsetail or something. But it could be reminiscent of a stool that he was intended to sit on. So that might be an early iteration of these chair legs. I'm going to be referencing characteristics of the Piedmontese tarot by Cheryl Smith from Tarot Heritage, and I will link that for you. What she did was to compare the Vergnano, which we saw with the super poofy pants, the Strambo by Il Manighello, a Tarocco Piemontese by Modiano, which I'm going to guess was probably a double-headed deck, the Lando Tarot from Stuart Kaplan, Volume 1 and page 150. So she compared those 4 decks and simply listed the characteristics she found in common. One suspicion she has, or had, was that the Piedmontese style developed indigenously in Piedmont as an Italian deck. That's not accepted across the board, and Berti, in his history book, is pretty clear that it is based on the Tarot de Marseille from French decks making their way back to Italy. And one thing she noted as a common factor is that he appears to be indoors with no vegetation at his feet in the decks she observed. She does note that none of these characteristics are consistent across all of the decks. Here we do have some vegetation here, and here who knows what's going on. She notes that Papeza has a double crown instead of a triple crown. Here it's been minimized to the point of no crown at all. And she notes a slanted band that's holding her cloak together. That's not as visible here. You can kind of see a band. But in the Lando here, you can see even more clearly that it's slanted. And most of these cards have a tax stamp remaining on them. It's so cool that Scarabeo did this. I hope they end up bringing some of these decks back. Now, in some of the decks that Cheryl Smith compared, the eagle on the Empress and the Emperor have a cross on them, which we can see right there and there. But we don't have those on any of these decks. We do have interesting patterns on all the eagles, though. Kind of even a pineapple kind of pattern here on Novamundi's deck, or on the Beltramo Torino. And she notes, which we see here, some heavy columns that almost look wing-like in the Empress. And here in the Spanish tarot, they've just been depicted as wings. In the Lombardy pattern, the Empress has wings, which is interesting. Again, all of these emperors, their eagles are patterned, but there isn't a cross. We do see this really exaggerated swooping visor on all of them. And here the crown replacing the helmet is another Piedmontese characteristic. And this was one of the arguments that Cheryl Smith had for against the Piedmontese pattern being based on the type 1 TDM, which is what's generally accepted. It was the fact that the Pope's staff has this little circular item with a flag on it. And the most common depiction of a type 1 TDM staff is the pastoral staff, or decorative shepherd's crook. However, in the Vashir, which is our earliest complete TDM deck of 1639, we see a pattern very much like that. So it might not be a flag, but it is definitely a round object topped by something that looks like it could be a flag. So in other TDM type 1 decks, like the Dodal and the Noble, we see a shepherd's crook. That's definitely not a shepherd's crook. So you can certainly see the similarity there. This is the deck that one of the Payan tarots is based on as well. So both the Vashir and the Payan tarots have that style. I'm not remembering the Payan dates off the top of my head, but one of them is based on the Vashir. The other one, the Tarot de Nostradamus is based on, and in that one we also see the same shape. I don't have any of the Payans proper, but that tells me that we've got 3 type 1 TDMs, the Vashir and 2 Payans, that have a shape like this. So to me that dispels any notion that this characteristic specifically would debunk the Piedmontese pattern being based on a type 1 TDM. Here we do see a cross on there as well, not a double cross, but a single one. And then in the Spanish tarot, what the heck is that? I don't know. I haven't seen anything like it, but maybe it's just an example of, you know, I haven't looked at the museum copy of this. Unfortunately, Fournier, as far as I know, hasn't published the original images. If you know of somewhere where they are published, please let me know. I haven't found them. So maybe, you know, there was some shape like this that was difficult to see, and that's how they interpreted it and cleaned it up. That would be my suspicion anyway. And this lover card, we have a pretty standard TDM. Here we have this one switched around, but in this one we see more of the Piedmontese style, where we have the crowned figure on the left, the figure with the flowers in her hair on the right, and we have a Cupid or Eros facing the left as in a type 1, but without a blindfold. In the Lombardy pattern, we'll see something similar where the Cupid is facing the left and the blindfold is like pushed up off the eyes. So it's there, but the Cupid is peeking, which I think is cute. This one, we just don't have a blindfold, but it is facing the type 1 direction, except in this case where the entire card has been reversed. And Cheryl Smith notes that in many decks, the two feminine figures do switch positions. One aspect of the Piedmontese chariot, which is most evident here, is that the horses tend to be more delicately drawn, and the chariot wheels are huge and prominent on the sides. So it just really creates a shape to the deck. Another Piedmontese characteristic is that the charioteer is holding a whip that's held diagonally. And we see across the canopy kind of a jagged scalloped pattern, which we see here as well in a different form. Now I will note here that this charioteer is holding a chair leg style scepter. I call them chair leg style, and that is a Lombardy pattern characteristic. And this is a pretty standard type 1 TDM style chariot with a rounded scalloped canopy. And notice here too that this one has the traditional pauldrons. These two do not have pauldrons on their shoulders or faces. In the Piedmontese pattern, we have the possible chair back looking more and more wing-like in the Justice card. And in this example, they've just gone ahead and drawn wings. And that's another, as I mentioned, aspect of the Lombardy pattern is that Justice and the Empress, in addition to the Temperance card, all have distinct wings. Another characteristic is this lace collar that she has. It's maybe visible a little bit there, but the dark green makes it hard to see. And here we have the traditional TDM gold chain or possible braid. Oh, going back to the chariot, Cheryl Smith notes that he has a cape draped over his shoulder rather than the epaulettes, which I assume are the pauldrons. So interesting. I thought I was noticing that for myself, but I guess not. The veil rendered as a double line around her face is a Piedmontese characteristic, which we definitely see in this Ottone deck. And that is from Cheryl Smith's site. And the drape behind her has a unique shape, and here again is just expressed as wings. We have a very monk-like hermit who often has rosary beads, which we can see clearly in this version of the card. And his hood is up in the Piedmontese style, which we see in both of these two. We don't see that here. And he's often carrying more of a crutch or a cane than a walking stick, which we see in both of these, but not in the Ottone deck. So this is super interesting, and I want you to keep this in mind for my follow-up video later when we talk about the Lombardy pattern. So there's kind of a joke in tarot history about, a telephone game being played with the Wheel of Fortune, where we can see over time that the body of this person who has a head and an ass's tail, the head gets less and less apparent, and the body turns into kind of a geometric shape, and the tail turns into a flame, which we later see expressed as a censer or incense burner or other kind of some kind of a flame burning vessel in the Soprafino type decks. So you can see that here where, this is clearly a person with a tail, and here it's looking much more flame-like. And here the body is even less pronounced, and this is more flame-like. And then later in Lombardy tarots, you can see this as a geometric vessel with a flame, and the head is even down here instead. So that's super interesting. I'll talk about that more in my Lombardy video. However, look at this. This is something I didn't notice until I got Nova's Beltramo deck, where it's not just this guy that was turned into a flaming censer, incense burner, but this guy too. So this creature starts out in the very early decks as probably an ass or a donkey, which is a common figure to be depicted on the Wheel of Fortune, and later is interpreted as other animals such as rabbits and foxes and things like that, and other nondescript critters. And here we see his head looking a little bit like a flame shape, isn't it? Until we get here, and this has been turned into a flame. So that's interesting. I hadn't seen before where the same phenomenon happened with the other figure, because I'm less inclined to see this as a flame, but you can see the progression here really clearly. So again, I'll talk more about that in my Lombardy pattern video. Lots of interesting shapes going on with this figure though, which you can see maybe led to some interesting interpretations there. And what do we see common across all three of these? It's one paw up for the lion, and a super funky, interesting looking lion in all cases. In the Lombardy pattern, you'll notice that both paws are up for the most part with the lion. So that's another interesting aspect. So definitely a little more resistance or fighting back from the lion in the Piedmontese pattern. And I have no idea who would look at this and say it's a standard Tarot de Marseille, because it for sure is not. How interesting is that? But all of the critters in the Piedmontese decks are just really, really cool looking. We see a more type 1 pattern here with the visible hands. And Cheryl Smith notes that the Piedmontese decks tend to have the hanged man in a jacket with a short skirted bottom to it. A very TDM-like death card, but super cool, fun characteristics. The Temperance card is sandaled in the Piedmontese pattern. And we don't see that here in the Ottone deck. So of the two Lando Devil cards I showed you earlier, one of them looks more like this, with the antlers on the imps and the devil, and a helmet on the devil and the torch here. Whereas the other Lando deck has this more bald-headed devil with horns on everybody and kind of a two-pronged pitchfork rather than a torch. But they all have a very distinct look. All of them resemble a Type 1 TDM. A lot of the Piedmontese decks will have eyes on the knees, as we see here on the Ottone deck. But again, it's not a consistent pattern, so we see quite a bit of variation. But there's a very folkloric look to it. It's really heavy lines, very intentional. So what I've noticed about the tower in the Piedmontese pattern is that we have both flames and a jagged arrow representing lightning. Whereas in the Lombardy pattern, we don't have the flames, we have just the jagged arrow for the most part. Now in the Ottone deck, we have this plant life, which I promise is lightning. Hear me out. So we see that in a lot of the TDM Type 1 decks, where we have this weird shape that is often interpreted as a floral sprig, or a sprig of, you know, some kind of leaves. But here we have the Solabusca engraved in 1491, and you can see pretty realistically painted. And this is a guy, probably Nimrod, getting struck by lightning. So that was just a way to depict lightning. And here it just happened to be colored to kind of lean into the interpretation of it as foliage. My understanding is that in the Bible, Nimrod, the character, was not struck by lightning, but that is a common story that grew up around that character. And we see that here in this Type 1 Vashir. So you can see why people interpret that as leaves, but it isn't. That's just lightning. One of the characteristics that Cheryl Smith lists is that a lack of a bird in the star, and I haven't seen that in the Piedmontese decks. I have seen it in the Lombardy decks, so that might be one of the instances where the Lombardy and Piedmontese patterns were getting confused. But what we do often see in Piedmontese decks are fewer stars. Here we have the 3 small stars. Sometimes there's only 5. Sometimes there's all 7, like we see here, of the small stars plus the 8th big star. But mostly I tend to see either 5 or 3 of the small stars. And in several of the decks, the bird is a rooster, which we see there. In the Ottone deck, we have the Type 1 style full moon, but here we have the side-facing moon, more similar to a Type 2 TDM. The Piedmont pool tends to be this square walled shape, and in some of them we have a church instead of one of the towers, which is kind of cool. And this doesn't even really look like a tower either, it's more of a house or shop maybe. I love the blue sun in the Spanish tarot. And the colors in these ones are lovely. This sun is not original to this deck. It's the one that Nova Mundi found from a different deck and restored to match this tarot. But overall, a pretty standard TDM sun card, unlike the Lombardy, where it looks very similar to this except for the children being clothed. So just something to keep in mind for when we look at the Lombardy tarot in another video. Cheryl Smith notes 4 people in the judgment cards in positions similar to the Della Rocco. I haven't found a Piedmontese one that has 4 people at the bottom of the judgment card. And otherwise I would say it's pretty standard TDM judgment. But a very Italian characteristic here, of the world card standing on an earth, and here being labeled with the city that the deck was made in. So earth is a little more subtle here, but it is visible. And check out these critters. Like, that lion is the best. I just love him. And again, some really cool looking critters there. But yeah, more prominent earth that the central figure is standing on, which is not visible here. Here we have the caped, more standard type 1 TDM world card. I should note that Cheryl Smith mentions a crescent moon on the head of the world card as a characteristic, and I haven't seen that in the Piedmontese decks. But back to the cups. Let's go through these pips. These all have really cool Two of Cups critters. Quite dragony. And more similar to the Type 1 style. And in the Lombardy Tarot, Lombardy pattern, we see that develop more into lions. I'll just appreciate these colors here. Let's see if we can get a better look at this text stamp. It's got that cross that we see on the eagle in some Piedmontese decks. These two being more similar to each other than this one. That's interesting. This is my first time seeing these cards, and oh, they're just lovely. Flower crowns all the way across the city. Guala, or however that's pronounced, is noted on many of these, and we have buckled shoes. The horses in the Piedmontese decks are adorable. They're so cute. Absolutely love them. And you can kind of see, you know, where this styling could have come, you know, been influenced by this early Ottone deck. Got a fancy feathered cap here. This has a window, which is really interesting. And we, for the most part, don't see the drapery that's often over the Queen of Cups, but we do see a hint of it here. And maybe this window developed from what used to be that drapery there. I just love the face in this King of Cups, and I would adore to see the original deck. I love the colors in this deck. Not sure what the originals were. This is another interesting characteristic of these cards specifically, that we do have the numbers doubled and diagonal. This could be a precursor to the shortly following double-headed Piedmontese pattern. A cool little tassel here, and what's possibly a flower bud or a fig in front of the ballet of batons. No labels original to these cards here. Definitely some variation here, and as I noted before, this is Liguria-Piedmont, and Berti does write a separate section on the Liguria, cards, which we don't have much evidence of anymore, but he notes that it's a really highly contested Piedmontese city, I guess, or a highly contested area considered part of Piedmont. So he notes that it has a style that came to be known as the Ligurian Marseillaise model, which to me, I would assume has a lot of similarity with the Piedmont style, but maybe these are some of the variations here. So we've got a very different kind of hat, different styling on the horses, that kind of thing. But all of these patterns, like I said, are just very poorly defined and not very consistent. So something interesting to notice. We have the laurel wreath on both of these queens of batons, but not on this one. And a little butterfly here where we don't see that in the fool. And she has a little bit of a building or wall in the background. Okay, a little scare. I almost thought I didn't have a king of batons, but he was hiding in the swords. Really interesting, distinct style here. Oh, we've got our cute little buckled shoes, which we see a lot in the Piedmontese cards. This is typical not to have these labeled both in the Piedmont and the Lombardy styles. Here's the eagle with the cross that we see in some of the Piedmont Emperor and Empress cards. But a fleur-de-lis here, interesting. Some of these delicate flowers are reminding me of the Lombardy pattern in this middle deck here. Did I say flowers? I meant leaves. Just the shapes of the leaves. Huh, just a little dot there on the 10. Very much a more soldier, militant look in a lot of these court cards, especially the knights in the Liguria-Piedmontese deck. And I wonder if that has something to do with how contested that area was. It sounds like there was a lot of military action, according to Giordano Berti's book. But look how cute and weird this horse is compared to this guy. So these are very Piedmont, I think. And a little bit different style here. It's almost a Roman kind of helmet. These two, the Queen of Coins with this very distinct, exaggerated version of what we see in the TDM is a characteristic of the Piedmontese style. I love her little shoes here. They almost look like mini Dutch clogs or something. And I don't know what's going on with her bodice. That's something stuffed in there, it looks like. And she's got an arrow here. So yeah, definitely a deviation. Maybe more warlike. I wonder. And a really distinct hat here with a crown on it. A little bit of, you know, possible crown shape on his hat. And a more hatty hat there. You've got some stalks of wheat here. I think that's pretty cool. More grass-like leaves. Tell me if you notice any similarities or distinctions from the standard 2DM that I haven't noticed. A little upside down guy here. I have seen images of these cut and they look really cool. I don't know if I would do that with a valuable vintage deck, but they look good that way. And when some of them are upside down like this, like you can even see from the tax stamp that it's upside down. That makes it tempting to want to cut off the borders. You almost have a bit of the poofy pants style happening that we see in the Piedmontese Fool, but just here in this middle Valley of Swords. Maybe it's more the round shape of his cloak behind him that gives it that look. And yeah, a very soldiery hat. More of a medieval looking warhorse here in both of these. So these are quite similar to each other. More of a straight-backed chair here. She's cradling her belly in these two, but not in this one. And overall pretty similar for the King of Swords, but without the decoration that we see on these two. But the very distinctive buckled shoes, which I just love. What a delight! I really enjoyed opening up this deck with you today. And as I said before, while there isn't a standardized Piedmontese pattern, we definitely see some Piedmont characteristics in this deck. Absolutely love this hermit. I love this drape he's got behind him. So what did you think? What do you think about the Piedmont pattern? I think it's so, I want to say folksy, but that sounds insulting. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. So folkloric maybe is more the term. And I just love the look of it. I think it's amazing. I'm so glad to have this deck. I'm very lucky to have this deck for sure. And let me know if you have any of these cool old Lo Scarabeo recreations. I think they're so amazing. And I think they're probably the precursor to the Anima Antiqua series that we see today. All right, well, thank you for joining me. I sure appreciate your presence. And I will see you again for some similar videos on other patterns, such as the Lombardy pattern. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.